Hi, everyone. I'm Stephanie Vaughn, Senior Marketing Manager with Voices for Healthy Kids at the American Heart Association. Welcome to Social Media for Advocacy, the second part of our four-part social media series. Today, we're focusing on how to apply the fundamentals that we learned about in the last session to your campaign work. But before we get started, we need to touch on a few housekeeping items. First of all, this call is being recorded for future playback. If you miss any part of it, we will have a recording available. And then a reminder that all lines will be muted during this webinar, but we are actively monitoring the chat function. So please ask any questions there. As I mentioned, this is the second training in a series of 4 about social media advocacy. The next 2 trainings in this series are listed here. Part 3 will be on October 28th, and part 4 is on November 12th. If you have not yet registered for these, please watch your email following this training for a link to register for these next 2. And you don't want to miss the 4th one, where we will have some hands-on practice and a chance to have your campaign questions answered in a skills lab format. So with all that being said, let's jump into today's content. I'd like to turn it over to my colleague, Brianna Kern, Media Advocacy Manager of the American Heart Association.
Thanks so much, Stephanie. And thank you all for joining us for part 2 of the Media Advocacy module. In today's session on campaign application for social media advocacy, we'll be covering these 3 goals you see here. So number 1, how to incorporate advocacy content alongside other organizational priorities. Number 2, what makes an advocacy campaign pop on different social media platforms. And then the 3rd one will be leveraging your digital brand to convert your community into taking action. So with that, we're going to start with what falls under the umbrella of advocacy content versus organizational content. And we're going to talk a little bit about what advocacy content is, and then Stephanie's going to help us get into how you can organize your content to allow for flexibility around our ever-changing advocacy priorities. So first up, the good thing is, even if you don't think you're doing social media advocacy, if you are already watching this webinar, you probably are. So these are the 4 main content buckets that I think about when I'm planning content for AHA's national advocacy channels. And they are, number 1, action alerts. This can be what we sometimes traditionally think of as a grassroots action alert, but more generally, it's direct calls for someone to take an action through a click-through. So whether that's writing an email, making a phone call, posting a message to their own social media pages, that's the action alert content bucket. The second one is news items on issue areas. So this might be a local news article that a measure is going to be coming to a vote at the city council, or it's an op-ed from a champion of an issue in Congress. Big or small, supportive or informative content around the issues you're working on in advocacy is always good to share. The third section, and this is the biggest bucket area of all, so I'm going to break it up into 2 smaller sections, is updates on campaigns. And for this, we think about it from 2 perspectives. Number 1 is from advocates or champions. So some of the content you might think of as a campaign update would be a meeting photo when an advocate meets with a lawmaker, and Zoom counts for this, or calls to action where we have champions for an issue calling for a specific need that our audience needs to know about. So for example, if a policymaker is saying that there's a deadline for comments or a town hall is coming up, any of those things would be in an instance where it's a campaign update that isn't coming from us, but it's coming from advocates and champions. The other section would be updates from your organization. So this is insider information. Of course, we're not talking about insider trading or anything like that, but it's more from the point of view that most people are not logging on to every town hall meeting. They aren't attending every session, digitally or otherwise, that a particular government body or policymaker is having. So if you're doing that as part of your work in an advocacy organization or any organization, you can be an insider by relaying that information from one space to another. That is a great place where you get to have a unique perspective to share on social media, where you're kind of going around the news item. If no one is reporting on it, you get to be that conduit of information, and that can make you very valuable. The other piece of updates on campaigns that come from your organization is that recap and reminder cycle. So this is essentially the, in case you missed it, our issue was supposed to move out of committee last week, but we got bumped. So as a reminder, our next step is that we need it to be taken up at the next meeting, those types of messages. And these are really helpful for an asynchronous communication technique like social media, where people are often only catching about 10% of what you're saying. So recapping them on what happened recently and reminding them what happens next is a really easy way to keep the campaign updates coming. And then finally, that last piece of advocacy content bucket is the win-loss statement. And most campaigns only have one of these, but they're still important to plan for. So at the end of the road, you need to be able to tell your audience if you won and congratulate, or if you've lost and you'll be trying again. And these types of messages that we just talked about are really the basics of what your key messages for a campaign are going to fall into. So what you'll need to do is be able to squeeze these types of content buckets, so the action alert, the campaign update, the news item, and the win-loss at the end, amongst all of the other things that you may be talking about as an organization. So that's events, fundraising, research, all of the above. So while we're focusing today on social media campaign application, there's another type of content that I really briefly want to mention that you should always have in your back pocket. And this will segue really nicely into what Stephanie is going to be talking about for us about how you can organize your advocacy content alongside other pieces. And this is really the advocacy education evergreen content. The idea that it doesn't die off, there's no season to it, it's always relevant. So most of the time, your organization has something to say about something. But in those moments when you don't, you want to try and slip some extra education into the mix. So if you have nothing new to say, you can remind people what it is that you care about. This can be really easily done if your organization is regularly prioritizing issues or building lists of issue-focused documents that you're working on. What you can do is just create these one-line messages from each of your priorities or issue areas that explains why you care about that thing. And then it's as easy as dropping it into a Word document or a spreadsheet that you can pull from in the future to post when things are slow. This is a really great content piece to incorporate into any of your year-end reporting, whether that's end of the fiscal year, or end of the calendar year. If you know that you're planning for the next year, that you're going to be focused on X, Y, and Z, write up those evergreen messages about X, about Y, and about Z, and put them away for when you're going to need them in the future. And an important thing to think about when you're doing a message like that, an evergreen message, is to try and have a link that you can have available to help people join you. So if you have access to a grassroots management platform like Nation Builder or Phone to Action, and you have a general campaign center link for list building or acquisition, then that can be added to these evergreen messages as a good solution to make sure that if someone is interested, but you don't have an action for them to take, that you don't lose them just because nothing is happening right now. If you don't have an action center, that's totally fine. Another great place you can send people to is an email newsletter sign up or anywhere on your website where someone can get connected. And the final other piece I just want to talk about briefly for evergreen content is that you can always be finding and joining conversations about what your organization cares about, even if there isn't an issue that is currently up for debate. Many coalitions host regular tweet chats about different topics, or they'll have Facebook Live sessions about these. Keep your eyes peeled for what other people are talking about in your space, and then follow them and join their conversations. And also, if you're doing that and you're not finding anyone talking, that could be a really great opportunity for you to start off those pieces. So now I'm going to pass it over to Stephanie to talk a little bit more about content organization.
Yeah, so let's talk about organizing your content. Unless your job is solely dedicated to social media advocacy, you probably have a lot of content available to you that either isn't 100% advocacy related, or you may have access to other social media content within your organization that isn't advocacy related, or it doesn't seem like it's advocacy related. And it seems like you may be competing for space on these social media accounts if you share them within your organization, but you can use non-advocacy content as an opportunity to support your own work. So think of non-advocacy content as an educational primer for you to introduce your work. For example, let's say it's National Fruit and Vegetable Month and part of your organization is running a campaign about healthy food. And it may be something that's super consumer focused, like tips on eating healthy or nutritional recipes, something like that. But let's say that you work on food access policies. While you're not specifically talking to consumers about healthy eating recipes or nutritional information, some of those broader consumer-friendly themes that you may find in your organization elsewhere, you can piggyback off that content with Advocacy Ask. So, something like, this nutrition info is great. Now let's make sure all kids have access to these nutritional foods in our community. And then you could have like a link to a petition. So it's a way of melding and kind of being creative with those opportunities as they come along. You can consider some of these more educational, fun consumer activities, as ground softening opportunities that lead into your advocacy work. And there are opportunities all around to link to your campaign work. It just takes some time to look ahead and to think strategically about where you can fit in. I think the other key here is communicating with other teams, with other campaigns, and even other organizations to see what they have going on, to see where you could fit in. So it's definitely possible to make your advocacy content work with non-advocacy material. It's just about creative brainstorming and thinking about how you can make that fit and make that fit with that consumer messaging. I will pause there and I will turn it back over to Rihanna to talk about working across different social media channels.
Awesome. Thanks, Stephanie. And I love thinking about ways that we can be coordinating more with other organizations and looking for those opportunities ahead of time. I think that end of year when everyone is doing their annual report is a great time for you to be thinking, okay, who are the partners that I have in this space and what are we all prioritizing next year so that we can think about the advocacy angle of that in addition to all of our other pieces. So like Stephanie teased, we're going to talk now a little bit about what it is that can make your advocacy campaign pop on different social media channels. So the idea is you just learned a little bit about what an advocacy post is, and these are going to be some of the best practices and tips for setting up your campaign plan and making sure that it pops. So if you watched our first webinar, this slide will look familiar to you, but before we can get ahead of ourselves and come up with that perfect campaign piece that's going to rock on Facebook, we have to answer these very, very important questions for your campaign. And they seem very basic, but this is really the core of your strategy. So having them written out somewhere helps you consider if what you're doing is strategic or not, or if your creative idea really fits with the goals that you're trying to accomplish. So especially if you're going to be adding advocacy to a really already busy editorial calendar for your organization, having these questions answered ahead of time helps you decide what messages need to be shared in what places and when. So I'm just going to walk through these questions really briefly, but the first, of course, is what do you want to change? And what we're going to be going through in the next couple of slides in this section is walking through a campaign that's active right now. So you'll get to see how these questions are answered and then implemented in social media as they go. So the first one is, what do you want to change? The second is, what is the solution or policy that you hope to see? So for example, if what you want to change is the number of children who can safely get to school, the solution or policy that we might be approaching with is a complete streets policy. But that doesn't mean that someone else won't be coming to the table with the same want for a change, but say what I really want is more bus routes. So you need to consider those as two different pieces because you're not always coming to the puzzle with the same plan, even if you have the same end goal picture in mind. The third is who has the power to make the necessary change? So who gets to be the final signature? Who are the signatures along the way? Who actually gets to say, okay, this is going to happen? The fourth, who must be mobilized to apply the necessary pressure? So these are the people who can influence those signature signers. So who do they need to listen to? Who do they like to listen to? Who have they historically listened to? Those are the kinds of questions you're answering when you're coming up with that campaign essential. And then the last piece of your campaign essential messages is, what do the targets need to hear? So what is going to make those people who we're mobilizing move to action, as well as the ultimate power holders? What do they need to hear in order for them to come around to what it is that we're hoping they'll do? And this slide looks very similar to the one we just looked at, but the key difference here is we're shifting from our power players and the overarching campaign goals and looking a little more closely at who we are already talking to and who we need to be talking to in order to reach those power players or individuals. So we'll be talking more about engaging with our audiences on social media during part 3 of this series on community management. But here is where you're really going to figure out what your place in a campaign is and who you might need to be working with to make sure that the campaign essentials from the previous slide are met. So that first question, who is your audience? Who are the people who are standing before you and listening to the things that you are saying, whether that's literally at meetings or digitally on social media, in your email inboxes? Even though we're talking about social media campaign applications, the audience that you have in front of you can be easily converted to that same social media audience. So you need to be thinking about, who is it that listens to us? The second, why are you engaging with this person or group? So why is it that you are coming to the table to talk with these people? What do you have to offer them? Why do you need to talk to them? The third, what common ground do you share with your audience? And this is really the key of all of the essentials that we're going to be answering here. It's, where do you all start from so that you can get to the next place? What is it that, no matter how you feel, if your favorite color is purple, your favorite color is green, at the end of the day, we all agree that this one thing is true. That's where you can always come back to in your key message development to ensure that you're reaching your audience and getting the correct messages across to get to your ultimate campaign goals. And the last audience essential question you're going to answer for yourself is, what story can you tell that will capture your audience? This is really based a lot on that common ground message, but what story is going to be compelling for those people so that they want to listen and advocate and be loyal to your cause? So I know this is a big block of text. I'm not going to stay here very long, but we're just going to be walking through on the next few slides an example campaign that's running right now around free school meals during COVID-19. We're not looking at every single aspect of the campaign. I've cherry-picked a few posts that we're going to talk through that explain some of the examples we're trying to make. But essentially, this slide here is how you might be filling out those campaign essentials from 2 slides ago before you start posting on social media. So in this instance, what is it that we want to change? We want all school children to have access to free breakfast and lunch for the 2020 through 2021 school year. What is the policy or solution we're going to be looking at people advocating for? A federal law that authorizes and funds a universal meal program for the USDA to run. Who has the power to make the necessary change? Ultimately, that's Congress and the USDA. Who must be mobilized to apply the necessary pressure? The next few slides we're going to be looking at are school lunch programs, hunger and nutrition advocates, and then some parent organizations. And then the final one, what is it that the targets need to hear? And this is where we start thinking about those key messages. The message here is that allowing all students to have access to free lunch for the school year removes a burden on schools, families, food service providers during COVID-19. So for our audience, we're going to be looking at how a few different organizations approach this campaign. So we'll talk through the different audiences as we look at each of their posts. Okay, so first up, we're going to talk through Facebook. You'll remember from our last webinar that the audience on Facebook tends to skew a little bit older and is more popular with women. So here we're looking at some posts from the School Lunch for All group, and that is a campaign that is led by the Urban School Food Alliance, which represents an audience of school food service professionals, and student voice, which is a by students for student group. So the audience that they are really appealing to when we're thinking about these posts, this is the school food providers, so the actual on the ground workers who are interacting with schools and with nutrition programs themselves, and then students, the ones who are going to be benefiting most directly from the existence of these free school meal programs. So when we're thinking about running a campaign on Facebook, what you need to be thinking about almost immediately is what kind of visual impact you can be making. Here you'll notice that the School Lunch for All group went with a bold text and bright colors approach, which is a really great substitute that you can use when you don't have a ton of images to share. In this instance, the school lunch tray is another very clear visual cue for what our topic is about, especially when we're thinking about the kinds of information people are taking in on Facebook. A lot of times what they're seeing are those videos of how to make different meals at home. So this is an interesting juxtaposition for you to be suddenly scrolling down your news feed and see a school lunch tray. When we're thinking about that older audience, they aren't used to seeing this, so it can be a thumb-stopping moment for them. Another important thing that you have to keep in mind when you're doing advocacy campaigns on Facebook is that you need to be feeding the algorithm what it wants. And most often that is shareable content. So your text and visuals should lend themselves on Facebook to being along the lines of a share if you agree message. For that, you can really lean into that recap and reminder cycle that we talked about earlier on in the Facebook, in the advocacy content bucket conversation, to make sure that people who are informed don't feel talked down to, and for the people who are new to your content through a share can catch up quickly. Gosh. Sorry. The other thing that you're going to want to be doing when you're talking on Facebook for advocacy is that you should always have something to click. So here in these two examples, it's a little bit small, so I'll read them off. One of the calls to action is sign the hashtag School Lunch for All petition. So very clearly at the bottom of the post, there's an action that somebody can take once they've read through the very short description they were provided. The other one is tag USDA and demand hashtag free lunch for all. So another very clear clickable action. You can click through to the USDA page, you can click through to the hashtag, and you are able to very quickly understand who is our audience. In this case, it's either tagging the USDA or this change.org petition also goes to the USDA. So that decision maker, that ultimate power holder is being looped into the conversation early. We know that the audience of this page are people who are working either directly in schools as school food service providers or are students. So they're a very interested party. And the messages that they're providing are informative. So as a reminder, this is the last week that the USDA can take action, and the recap. So that's the recap. And then the reminder is, without this extension, families and students will lose the only form of guaranteed support that they have. So this is a good way to see how somebody is working in action on Facebook. So in the same campaign, now we're looking at how a few other groups are standing out on Twitter while talking about the same pieces. And what's going to be interesting here, and I want you all to take note of, is how the messages changed from Facebook to Twitter. Oftentimes when we're thinking of our social media strategy, we fall into the trap of thinking we only need one thing that we're going to say on social media. But oftentimes if you personalize for the platform, you're going to see better results because people interact on the websites differently, the algorithms are different, the audiences are different, and all of those things can add up when you're trying to make change. So the first thing to remember when you're talking on Twitter is keep it quick and keep it relevant. One thing that you can always be doing is sharing a unique piece of information, like a statistic. So here we see the CSPI Twitter account, that's one in the background, has a stat that they've pulled out of a news item that says 1 in 4 parents say that they've gone into debt due to the increased costs of their children learning remotely from home. So this is a great example for two of the advocacy buckets we talked about earlier. Number one, it's a news article, so a news item on the issue area. And then number two, it's that insider knowledge piece where most people may not be looking at this type of research in their day-to-day lives. So you get to have that unique perspective by sharing it with the people you know will be interested. Another key here for talking on Twitter is that you need to tap into the trends by looking at what's being discussed on your newsfeed. In this case, and in both posts, we're seeing discussions of remote learning. That's very big on Twitter right now. Everyone's talking about it. Of course, the ongoing economic instability in our country, very much trending, very much relevant. And then thirdly, the pairing of that with our issue area, which is the free school meals for all argument that we're making. So we see that two different organizations have done this in very interesting ways. Both of them are doing something that is always very important, and I'll remind again, using a hashtag strategically. You'll notice that both of these posts only uses one hashtag, one. And I know it's hard. I know we like to share as much as we can and link as many conversations as we can, but the more strategic you are about your posts, the more credible that you come off. So if you have two things to say, you have two hashtags you must use, then you can do it. But my recommendation is always to try and stick to one and keep yourself, keep it strategic, be sparing, use your hashtag sparingly so that no one thinks that you're just trying to get as many people looking as possible and not actually caring about the issue. The last piece we're going to talk about here for standing out on Twitter is how you can share the voices of others and tag your decision makers in a meaningful way. So here in the foreground, we see that Student Voice, which is one of the groups that we know is connected with the School Lunch for All campaign, retweeted a guide about how to contact members of Congress. And as you remember, that's one of the audiences we identified in our campaign essentials as the people who can make the policy. And then they use the appropriate hashtag to make sure that the information that was provided is being weaved into that conversation that we're building. So this is an interesting way for us to look at how the different advocacy content buckets that we identified early on can be used in different ways while still being part of that same conversation. Next, what we're looking at here when we're talking about campaign application of advocacy on Instagram is a screenshot of some of the top posts that are under the hashtag School Lunch for All on Instagram. And the things that you'll notice are working here, as in they've been identified by the algorithm as top posts, are people, data, and video. If you can do one or all of those things on Instagram, you're going to get much higher results than if you can do none of them. So we see in this grid 3 posts of people, 1 data graphic specifically, and then 2 different videos. And that's interesting because we're thinking about how on Facebook, the big and bright and bold really worked. It also applies on Instagram, not quite as important on Twitter. We thought about on Twitter how being very quick, being very relevant, being very short was key. Whereas on Instagram, we see a lot more text here. We see some that don't have any text at all. So the visual aspect is much more interesting on this platform. But one thing you need to keep in mind when you're doing advocacy on Instagram is that it's not as likely to drive an organizational change as it is on, for example, Twitter. And by that, I really mean that lawmakers and decision makers themselves as an audience are not tracking Instagram the way that they are with Twitter and Facebook for engaging with constituents. Of course, there are exceptions to that rule. There are always some people who are very active and very forward on different platforms, but we know that the decision makers who are very active on Twitter and on Facebook are at that higher level, whereas Instagram is a really great platform for engaging with grassroots advocates. I'm seeing there's a quick question in the chat. Is there a text message that goes with these graphics? That's a great question. Yes, each of these posts, I don't have a screenshot of them, but each of these posts has a caption on it. but more likely on Instagram, these will be shared without that text to other pages. So when you're posting on Instagram, most frequently with advocacy, people are sharing the visual. And while they may be reading the text, when they're sending it along to someone else, that text doesn't always follow as closely. So the images that you're sharing need to convey a lot of what it is that you're trying to say without leaning too heavily on your caption. One thing I just want to point out here is that a really key part of Instagram advocacy is giving people something to do. And you need to tell them directly what it is that you want them to say or think or do. So for example, we need more than just a temporary fix to feeding kids at school. That's something very directly of what we think and what we want other people to say. Or no student should ever go hungry. Very direct, very clear what it is that we're asking without any hedging around or extra explanations. Or for example, how can you help make hashtag school lunch for all a reality? And then that one is a video of actions that can be taken. So this type of content sometimes feels confrontational for us to create, and it doesn't always mirror your Facebook and Twitter approaches, but standing out on Instagram as a platform requires direct language and direct action. So as always, this is something I mentioned last time we were talking about social media, but add a link to the bio, which is the profile section of your Instagram, to make sure that people can click, because that is the only clickable place on Instagram is your bio. So even if you drop the link into the caption, no one can follow it. You need to make sure that your profile is linking out to a very meaningful action center. So with that, of course, if you have more questions about specific platforms, you can drop them into the chat, but I'm going to pass it back now to Stephanie to talk more about converting our community into advocates.
Thanks. Yeah, so to understand how marketing relates to converting those social media advocates and to advocacy in general, we need to have a very simple, basic understanding of marketing. And I'll just quickly do a nice little overview, and then we can dig deeper into the social media side. But traditionally, marketing is made up of the 4 Ps: product, price, place, and promotion. And I know that sounds a lot different than the work that we do within advocacy, but it's not. So think of it this way. Our product is the policy that we want passed. The price is the amount of effort, time, or investment, either financial or non-financial, that our advocates have to make. The place is where we reach them, so online, in person, over the phone, through advertisements, other places. And then the promotion aspect is just that, it's promotion, how we build support for that policy. So while we aren't selling a product, we are actually selling an idea. And let's get a little abstract here and think about what that means. That idea could be anything from reducing sugary drinks to making sure schools have clean water. And if we want to go a step deeper, we're not just selling the policy that we want implemented. We could say that the policy is just a vehicle for our larger idea, and that idea is the result that we're looking for from that policy. So for example, we're marketing the idea that all children should live in healthier communities, or the idea that all families should be able to access healthy food, or whatever it is that you're hoping to accomplish in your campaign. But that's the idea that we're actually selling when we're looking at this through a marketing angle. So how do we sell the advocacy idea through social media? So this next slide is the marketing funnel. I think a lot of you will see that it's similar to the advocacy ladder of engagement, which I'll touch on in a few minutes. But fundamentally, it's the plan of moving your audiences to take action. So this graphic is the basic marketing funnel combined with the social media funnel framework. So it consists of 5 phases. So first of all is awareness. That's attracting new people who are currently unaware of your brand or your campaign or your organization. So this is the educational component. What is your mission and what are you asking your audience to do? From there, it's consideration. So standing out among social media competition so that these new audience members remember you. Every organization, every cause, everybody is on social media and competing for your attention. So, think about how many tweets you see or posts you see in your news feeds daily. To get an advocate to notice you, you have to have engaging content, something that makes them care about your cause. And I think the big question here is, what's in it for them? Why do they want to care about your cause? The next step is action or conversion, and this is compelling your audience to take that action. So what are you asking them to do? Why should they take action? What can you put in your tweet or your Facebook post or Instagram post that gets someone to move from reading that post and then actually taking some kind of action, like signing a petition or showing up at an event? From there, we take it down a step further to loyalty and engagement. So this is using social media to stay top of mind. So once they take action, you want them to take it again. How do you keep them invested in your campaign? And this could be something as simple as doing a storytelling series on a specific topic that you know interests them. This keeps them engaged and this keeps them coming back. And that brings us to the final step of this marketing funnel, which is advocacy. And that's where we want to get. This is building enough trust with your audience that they want to recommend you to others and recruit other advocates for you. So this is where you get the highly invested, highly motivated advocates. This is what you can consider your grassroots base. These are the people that you can rely on to get into the trenches with you. These are the people who keep coming back and are solid supporters. So with all of that being said, let's relate this to the ladder of engagement on the next slide. So you all have probably heard of an engagement ladder when it comes to taking action. Once your audience has reached the advocacy level of the marketing funnel, you'll want to get people to take bigger and bigger actions. Traditionally, we classify actions from low to high, whereas getting to someone to sign a petition for a lawmaker is low because it's an easy, low effort ask. You can just ask someone to sign their name. It doesn't take much time or effort on the part of the advocate. And then you, as you move them up the ladder, say you want an advocate to meet in person with a lawmaker, that requires a lot more effort on that advocate's part. It requires more time, energy, maybe a financial investment if there's travel. But the point is, the ladder of engagement can be very challenging traditionally. What's cool about social media, though, is that it transcends that ladder. It can be as low or high engagement as you make it. So something as simple as a retweet, which is super low engagement, it's literally somebody just seeing your post, hitting a button to retweet it, all the way up to participating in a virtual town hall, for example, which requires more effort, more time. But what's great is it gives us the ability to give advocates the ability to take action in a convenient, easy, and typically free way, while they're sitting on their couch in their pajamas. It's an easy way to get people involved, and the easier we make it for people to take action, the more likely they are to actually do it. So on the next slide, before I hand it back over to Rihanna, I just wanted to quickly touch on framing action taking. So a few things to remember here. Your audience is your audience for a reason, right? They care about what you're doing. Otherwise, they wouldn't be following you on social media. So taking action can be seen as a natural progression for them. You have to craft your ask in a way that's appealing to that specific audience and motivates them. Then when you are asking them to do something, make it clear, make it simple, let them know what you're asking and what you're asking them to do. The easier you can make it for them, the more likely they are to take that action. And then finally, when you're working with people who aren't used to taking action, remember that it could be a big step for them. So give them the opportunity to reach out to you with questions that might make them more comfortable and help guide them to that next step. Let them know you're there to help them and you'll get the results you want. So with that, I will turn it back over to Rana for a wrap up of everything we've been talking about today.
Great, thanks so much. So what we're going to be talking about these next couple slides, it's really a recap of what we just went through, but I wanted to present it to you all in a way that you could either screenshot or print out, but thinking about these 4 steps of a social media advocacy campaign that you can be applying to your next big jump. So the first one, this is the biggest part. You need to answer your campaign and your audience questions from earlier in this presentation. And the essential answers that we're looking for here are, who are we trying to reach? What do we want them to do? Who are we currently talking to? And what do they like to hear? These are what we might think of as the very traditional who, what, where, when, why, how. But when we're doing social media advocacy, having these answers written out in a place that we can look at, and I do mean literally, I have millions of printouts of our social media campaigns going on, helps you make sure that the messages you're putting out are rooted in your goals and your audience and will be meaningful. The second step is determining what do we have to say about this. So we know what our goals are, we know how we can make them happen and who we need to hear from, but we need to figure out what it is that we're going to say that fits with our position in the market. And that can be in the advocacy market, it can be within our specific sector, or it could be within the minds of the decision makers. How do they think of us? And therefore, what would make sense for them to hear from us versus a partner or a coalition or any other group who might have a social media presence and a stake in this battle. So think about that marketing funnel that Stephanie was talking about, and consider where a decision maker is in that process on an issue that you're working on. Is this brand new for them and they're at the awareness stage and you need to give them some education? And what you're asking your advocates to do is inform them that this is happening and that you care. Or they may be at that loyalty stage where this is a decision maker who's a huge champion for you already. So this applies really across your audience ranges, from both the people that you're talking to as an audience and who you might be asking that audience to talk to on your behalf, which is what we think of as our advocacy base. So that's when you're determining your key messages in your content. What are the 2 or 3 things that will help our campaign and resonate with our audience that we can add to this conversation? What visuals do we have available to us? Do we have some great videos from advocates already? Do we have some pictures from some, recent meetings? Do we know that our group is willing to take those photos or identify themselves in videos of their own? Or do we just have some photos that are just very compelling about what our issue area is about? Is this something about the environment around us where we can take a picture of it, go out and do that groundwork? Or is it about people where we need to really find some stories? Thinking about those things ahead of time before you're ready to make the social media post can make sure that your campaign is successful. And then finally, what is our action? Where does it live? Is it a website? Is the action an in-person ask we're making? Is the action an email we need sent? Figuring that out before you're ready to post on social media means that you'll know exactly where you're sending people when you need to send them there. And the second part of step 2 at this point is figuring out what success looks like. So we often at this point know what the ultimate goal of our campaign is because we followed step 1 and we figured that out in our campaign essentials. So this answer may sometimes be the same. It's the policy success. But sometimes we know that this just isn't going to happen this season. The lawmakers are all at the awareness stage and no one is ready to really make the push on our behalf. So we need to determine what is it that we can walk away with and know that we've still done the best we can. And I like something that I saw in the chat earlier about recognizing all outcomes as wins. So this is a great opportunity where we can establish that to say this might be a ground softening campaign or a partnership building or even just building of conversational momentum. So while we didn't reach the ultimate goal of the policy win, we didn't lose because we determined what success looks like for this particular piece. The third step here is where I'm finally going to let you post on Facebook or Twitter or Instagram or wherever you're talking, but you're using that knowledge from part 1 of our webinar series of who is on different platforms. We're pairing that with our audience essential message, our audience essential question answers, and then we're going to start using those key messages from step 2 to talk. So think about what Stephanie told us about pairing that advocacy content with our organizational content, and then decide which social media platforms you're using and put some content out there and see how people are responding. It's important at this point to stay flexible and be ready to adapt. You want to read your comments, you want to see who is sharing your information or not sharing your information, and get ready to think about how you can start moving people from one step to another. So whether that's down the marketing funnel from awareness to loyalty, or it's in the form of a more traditional engagement ladder when we're at that loyalty stage of a 4-message email or a personalized social media video to a high priority lawmaker, we need to be thinking all the time about how can we be sharing our posts with a lot of intention and an audience in mind so that we know who it is we're trying to reach and what we want them to do. And then the final step here is engaging and assessing. So remember, you're never ever posting into a vacuum, and that is a good thing. Sometimes it's scary, but there are people on the other side, and that's what we're trying to really do with all of our work, is reach people through social media as a place that they spend a lot of their time. So you want to try and engage and talk with your community, especially your champions. Our next webinar is going to talk even more about what good community engagement practices look like, but essentially, if there are questions being asked, you want to answer them. And if there are new information pieces being shared with you, recognizing and appreciating the people who are sharing those pieces of information with you are some really great, really low level community engagement things that you can do that are low risk. Oops. And then lastly, what you're going to want to be doing is assessing if you're reaching your campaign essential goals. So if you're listening to this webinar now in mid-October, you should have some time to start answering those questions and getting posting online. So you'll be able to start talking with us on our fourth webinar on November 12th with some personalized ways to pivot if things aren't working, or some personalized ways for you to amplify your campaign if you've gotten it started in time. So with that, I will open up for any final questions you all might have. Otherwise, thank you so much for joining us. And I think that we'll be dropping a link in the chat shortly for an evaluation so that we can hear from you. Great. Well, I'm not seeing too many more questions. I think that evaluation link will go out to everyone following this conversation. And if you have anything that comes up in the meantime, please bring it up to our next webinar, which I don't have the date, which is on October 28th at 2 p.m. Central. So we look forward to talking to you all again.
Thank you.
Hey, Rihanna, I actually did have a question. This is
Sure.
Tara, Media Advocacy Manager. So one of the things I've noticed in using Instagram especially is like a lot of influencers will use a ton of hashtags, and I imagine, and it's oftentimes it's related to whatever they're promoting, but I imagine it's so people can really find them. So like, you know, a health and fitness might use, 15 or so hashtags related to health and fitness. It seems counterintuitive not to then use as many hashtags as you can on your own campaign. So like you would use your own hashtag. For example, state of childhood obesity was released today. So you might say hashtag state of childhood obesity, and then you might use some health related hashtags to try and get more eyes on it. But you're saying not to do that. So I was just wondering if you could maybe elaborate just a little bit more on why that isn't a good idea.
Sure. So I think it's very platform specific. So Twitter can't support too many hashtags. That's where I would definitely recommend we stick to one or two if we really have to. Instagram is definitely a different game, like you said, Tara. So if you are sharing on Instagram, you do not need to limit yourself. I think that Instagram limits you to 30 hashtags per comment. So don't do more than that. Otherwise, you're just filling your entire comment section with hashtags. But it's an important point, one that I should have brought up at that point. But you can be doing a lot more conversation grouping on Instagram than you can be doing on the other platforms. So for example, you were talking about the State of Childhood Obesity report. I could imagine there being a really great intersection of the nutrition community, but also the physical activity community, and perhaps childhood wellness groups or mom groups and different people who might be interested in those outcomes. So I would say you can post with less fear on Instagram using hashtags. The I think the standard practice on the platform is a lot more forgiving for that. So as long as you're providing some information up front and not only using hashtags, then you'll be in the clear. That was a great question. All right, well, I guess seeing no other comments coming up in the chat, we'll talk to you all again in a couple weeks.